Hi, Dad. I know you're lonely in the nursing home, so I thought I'd start reading to you some short stories. The first short story I'm going to read to you is from the Roald Dahl Omnibus, and it's called Taste. Taste. There were six of us to dinner that night at Mike Schofield's house in London. Mike and his wife and his daughter, my wife and I, and a man named Richard Pratt. Richard Pratt was a famous gourmet. He was president of a small society known as the Epicures, and each month he circulated privately to its members a pamphlet on food and wines. He organized dinners where sumptuous dishes and rare wines were served. He refused to smoke for fear of harming his palate, and when discussing wine, he had a curious, rather droll habit of referring to it as though it were a living being. A prudent wine, he would say, rather diffident and evasive, but quite prudent. Or, a good-humored wine, benevolent and cheerful, slightly obscene, perhaps, but nonetheless good-humored. I had been to dinner at Mike's twice before when Richard Pratt was there, and on each occasion Mike and his wife had gone out of their way to produce a special meal for the famous gourmet. And this one clearly was to be no exception. The moment we entered the dining room, I could see that the table was laid out for a feast. The tall candles, the yellow roses, the quantity of shining silver, and 3 wine glasses to each person, and above all, the faint scent of roasting meat from the kitchen brought the first warm oozings of saliva to my mouth. As we sat down, I remembered that on both Richard Pratt's previous visits, Mike had played a little betting game with him over the claret, challenging him to name its breed and its vintage. Pratt had replied that should not be difficult, provided it was one of the great years. Mike had then bet a case of the wine in question that he could not do it. Pratt had accepted and had won both times. Tonight I felt sure that the little game would be played over again, for Mike was quite willing to lose the bet in order to prove that his wine was good enough to be recognized, and Pratt, for his part, seemed to take a grave, restrained pleasure in displaying his knowledge. The meal began with a plate of whitebait, fried very crisp in butter, and to go with it, there was a mazzole. Mike got up and poured the wine himself, and when he sat down again, I could see that he was watching Richard Pratt. He had set the bottle in front of me so that I could read the label. It said, Gersle Oligsburg, 1945. He leaned over and whispered to me that Gersle was a tiny village in the Moselle, almost unknown outside of Germany. He said that this wine we were drinking was something unusual, that the output of the vineyard was so small that it was almost impossible for a stranger to get any of it. He had visited Gersle personally the previous summer in order to obtain the few dozen bottles that they had finally allowed him to have. I doubt anyone else in the country has any of it at the moment, he said. I saw him glance again at Richard Pratt. Great thing about Moselle, he continued, raising his voice. It's a perfect wine to serve before a claret. A lot of people serve a Rhine wine instead, but that's because they don't know any better. A Rhine wine will kill a delicate claret. You know that. It's barbaric to serve the Rhine before a claret, but a Moselle, a Moselle is exactly right. Mike Schofield was an amiable, middle-aged man, but he was a stockbroker. To be precise, he was a jobber in the stock market. And like a number of his kind, he seemed to be somewhat embarrassed, almost ashamed to find that he had made so much money with so slight a talent. In his heart he knew that he was not really much more than a bookmaker, an unctuous, infinitely respectable, secretly unscrupulous bookmaker. and he knew that his friends knew it too. So he was seeking now to become a man of culture, to cultivate a literary and aesthetic taste, to collect paintings, music, books, and all the rest of it. His little sermon about the Rhine wine and Moselle was a part of this thing, this culture that he sought. "A charming little wine, don't you think?" he said. He was still watching Richard Pratt. I could see him give a rapid, furtive glance down the table each time he dropped his head to take a mouthful of whitebait. I could almost feel him waiting for the moment when Pratt would take his first sip and look up from his glass with a smile of pleasure, of astonishment, perhaps even of wonder, and then there would be a discussion and Mike would tell him about the village of Gearsley. But Richard Pratt did not taste his wine. He was completely engrossed in conversation with Mike's 18-year-old daughter, Louise. He was half turned towards her, smiling at her, telling her, so far as I could gather, some story about a chef in a Paris restaurant. As he spoke, he leaned closer and closer to her, seeming in his eagerness almost to impinge upon her, and the poor girl leaned as far as she could away from him, nodding politely, rather desperately, and looking not at his face but at the topmost button of his dinner jacket. We finished our fish, and the maid came around, removing our plates. When she came to Pratt, she saw that he had not touched his food, so she hesitated, and Pratt noticed her. He waved her away, broke off his conversation, and quickly began to eat, popping the little crisp brown fish quickly into his mouth with rapid jabbing movements of his fork. Then, when he had finished, he reached for his glass, and in 2 short swallows, he tipped the wine down his throat and turned immediately to resume his conversation with Louise Schofield. Mike saw it all. I was conscious of him sitting there, very still, containing himself, looking at his guest. His round, jovial face seemed to loosen slightly and to sag, but he contained himself and was still and said nothing. Soon the maid came forward with the second course. This was a large roast beef. She placed it on the table in front of Mike, who stood up and carved it, cutting the slices very thin, laying them gently on the plates for the maid to take around. When he had served everyone, including himself, he put down the carving knife and leaned forward with both hands on the edge of the table. "Now," he said, speaking to all of us, but looking at Richard Pratt, "now for the claret. I must go and fetch a claret if you'll excuse me." You go and fetch it, Mike." "Where is it?" "In my study, with the cork out, breathing." "Why the study?" "Acquiring room temperature, of course. It's been there 24 hours. "But why the study?" "It's the best place in the house. Richard helped me choose it last time he was here." At the sound of his name, Pratt looked around. That's right, isn't it?" Mike said. "Yes," Pratt answered, nodding gravely. "That's right." "On top of the green filing cabinet in my study," Mike said. "That's the place we chose. A good draft-free spot in a room with an even temperature. Excuse me now, will you, while I fetch it." The thought of another wine to play with had restored his humor, and he hurried out the door, to return a minute later, more slowly, walking softly, holding in both hands a wine basket in which a dark bottle lay. The label was out of sight, facing downward. "Now," he cried, as he came toward the table. "What about this one, Richard? You'll never name this one." Richard Pratt turned slowly and looked up at Mike. Then his eyes traveled down to the bottle nestling in the small wicker basket, and he raised his eyebrows, a slight supercilious arching of the brows, and with it a pushing outward of the wet lower lip, suddenly imperious and ugly. "You'll never get it," Mike said. "Not even in 100 years." "A claret?" Richard Pratt asked condescendingly. "Of course." I assume then that it's from one of the smaller vineyards. Maybe it is, Richard. And then again, maybe it isn't. But... Excuse me. But it's a good year, one of the great years. Yes, I guarantee that. Then it shouldn't be too difficult, Richard Pratt said, drawling his words, looking exceedingly bored. Except that to me there was something strange about his drawling and his boredom. Between the eyes a shadow of something evil, and in his bearing an intentness that gave me a faint sense of uneasiness as I watched him. This one is really rather difficult, Mike said. I won't force you to bet on this one. Indeed, and why not? Again, the slow arching of the brows, the cool, intent look. Because it's difficult. That's not very complimentary to me, you know. My dear man, Mike said, I'll bet you with pleasure, if that's what you wish. It shouldn't be too hard to name it. You mean you want to bet? I'm perfectly willing to bet, Richard Pratt said. All right then, we'll have the usual, a case of the wine itself. You don't think I'll be able to name it, do you? As a matter of fact, and with all respect, I don't, Mike said. He was making some effort to remain polite, but Pratt was not bothering overmuch to conceal his contempt for the whole proceeding. And yet, curiously, his next question seemed to betray a certain interest. You like to increase the bet? No, Richard. A case is plenty. Would you like to bet 50 cases? That would be silly. Mike stood very still behind his chair at the head of the table, carefully holding the bottle in its ridiculous wicker basket. There was a trace of whiteness around his nostrils now, and his mouth was shut very tight. Pratt was lolling back in his chair, looking up at him, eyebrows raised, eyes half closed, a little smile touching the corners of his lips. And again I saw, or thought I saw, something distinctly disturbing about the man's face. That shadow of intentness before the eyes, and in the eyes themselves, right in their centers, where it was black, a small, slow spark of shrewdness hiding. So you don't want to increase a bet. As far as I'm concerned, old man, I don't give a damn, Mike said. I'll bet you anything you like. The three women and I sat quietly, watching the two men. Mike's wife was becoming annoyed. Her mouth had gone sour, and I felt that at any moment she was going to interrupt. A roast beef lay before us on our plates, slowly steaming. So you'll bet me anything I like. That's what I told you. I'll bet you anything you damn well please, if you want to make an issue out of it. Even 10,000 pounds? Certainly I will, if that's the way you want it. Mike was more confident now. He knew quite well that he could call any sum Pratt cared to mention. So you say I can name the bet? Pratt asked again. That's what I said. There was a pause while Pratt looked slowly around the table, first at me, then at the three women, each in turn. He appeared to be reminding us that we were witnesses to the offer. Mike, Mrs. Schofield said, Mike, why don't we stop this nonsense and eat our food? It's getting cold. But it isn't nonsense, Pratt told her evenly. We're making a little bet. I noticed the maid standing in the background, holding a dish of vegetables, wondering whether to come forward with them or not. All right, then. I'll tell you what I want to bet. Come on, then, Mike said, rather reckless. I don't give a damn what it is. You're on. Pratt nodded, and again the little smile moved the corners of his lips, and then quite slowly, looking at Mike all the time, he said, I want you to bet me the hand of your daughter in marriage.